Do Buddhists believe in devils?
Perhaps the closest thing in Buddhism to what many readers think of when they hear the word devil is the archdemon Mara. As the Buddha achieved enlightenment, Mara assailed him in hopes of preventing him from sharing his newfound wisdom. Mara summoned up his own 3 seductive daughters as well as his hateful host of demons. Various troublesome beings, from the mildly mischievous to the viciously malevolent, haunt the Buddhist universe at every level. Unhappy spirits of the deceased pester the living. A class of characters called earth demons personify various powers and riches of the earth itself. Human beings who die after a particularly unethical life may be reborn as one of a class of evil beings. Inherited from Hindu tradition, called asuras. Just as the Buddha insisted that none of the gods could rescue anyone from the human condition, so he taught that no demonic power was great enough to destroy anyone. Still, mainstream Buddhism has allowed room for the ranks of devilish characters that are part of indigenous popular belief systems throughout Asia.
Do Buddhists believe in devils?
Perhaps the closest thing in Buddhism to what many readers think of when they hear the word devil is the archdemon Mara. As the Buddha achieved enlightenment, Mara assailed him in hopes of preventing him from sharing his newfound wisdom. Mara summoned up his own 3 seductive daughters as well as his hateful host of demons. Various troublesome beings, from the mildly mischievous to the viciously malevolent, haunt the Buddhist universe at every level. Unhappy spirits of the deceased pester the living. A class of characters called earth demons personify various powers and riches of the earth itself. Human beings who die after a particularly unethical life may be reborn as one of a class of evil beings. Inherited from Hindu tradition, called asuras. Just as the Buddha insisted that none of the gods could rescue anyone from the human condition, so he taught that no demonic power was great enough to destroy anyone. Still, mainstream Buddhism has allowed room for the ranks of devilish characters that are part of indigenous popular belief systems throughout Asia.
Are dreams and visions important to Buddhist tradition?
Important figures in Buddhist tradition are said to have learned essential truths through dreams and visions. Queen Maya dreamed that she would give birth under unusual circumstances to a child who would become the Buddha. In dreams, famous people learn of the proper course of action. Buddhist sources tell, for example, of how a dream persuaded the Chinese Emperor Mingdi to send for Buddhist missionaries and scriptures. Stories of this sort are told about many holy persons throughout Buddhist history. usually as a vehicle for underscoring the individual's personal authority. Accounts of dreams and visions are by no means uniquely Buddhist, of course. And tell us more about the tone and feel of popular Buddhist lore than about the tradition's central teachings. Visionary meditative techniques, a different matter altogether, are of great importance in some Mahayana schools. Esoteric schools, such as those of Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism, use mandalas as visual aids in complicated techniques for creating mental images. The meditator generates a visionary world patterned on the mandala, in which the divine and the human interact and all distinctions vanish. Simpler visualization techniques are used in the more popular Pure Land tradition as well. Facing west, the meditator visualizes the sun setting, and water turning into ice. Gradually, the mind fills with images of a golden land with crystalline streams, lotus-filled lakes with golden bottoms, and shores of diamond sand. As the Pure Land, with its myriad jeweled palaces, takes shape in the mind's eye, the meditator sees the Buddha Amitabha and his attendant bodhisattvas. At length the meditator visualizes himself being reborn into that happy land enfolded in a lotus flower.
Are dreams and visions important to Buddhist tradition?
Important figures in Buddhist tradition are said to have learned essential truths through dreams and visions. Queen Maya dreamed that she would give birth under unusual circumstances to a child who would become the Buddha. In dreams, famous people learn of the proper course of action. Buddhist sources tell, for example, of how a dream persuaded the Chinese Emperor Mingdi to send for Buddhist missionaries and scriptures. Stories of this sort are told about many holy persons throughout Buddhist history, usually as a vehicle for underscoring the individual's personal authority. Accounts of dreams and visions are by no means uniquely Buddhist, of course. And tell us more about the tone and feel of popular Buddhist lore than about the tradition's central teachings. Visionary meditative techniques, a different matter altogether, are of great importance in some Mahayana schools. Esoteric schools, such as those of Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism, use mandalas as visual aids in complicated techniques for creating mental images. The meditator generates a visionary world patterned on the mandala, in which the divine and the human interact and all distinctions vanish. Simpler visualization techniques are used in the more popular Pure Land tradition as well. Facing west, the meditator visualizes the sun setting, and water turning into ice. Gradually, the mind fills with images of a golden land with crystalline streams, lotus-filled lakes with golden bottoms, and shores of diamond sand. As the Pure Land, with its myriad jeweled palaces, takes shape in the mind's eye, the meditator sees the Buddha Amitabha and his attendant bodhisattvas. At length the meditator visualizes himself being reborn into that happy land enfolded in a lotus flower.
What kind of religious calendar do Buddhists observe?
Since Buddhism has long been identified with so many different cultural settings, there is some variation in the ways Buddhists keep track of sacred times. The basic religious calendar remains tied, at least nominally, to the ancient Hindu combination of lunar and solar reckoning. But many Buddhists now observe some festivities on fixed dates. The earliest Buddhists apparently did not concern themselves with marking special occurrences on their calendar. But within a generation or so, India's growing and spreading Buddhist communities began to incorporate religious social occasions into ordinary life. As Buddhist communities arose outside of India, they naturally tended to blend religious observances imported by Buddhist missionaries with the indigenous festivities of the land. In most places where Buddhism is an important presence today, the reckoning of years begins with the date of the Buddha's entry into nirvana, which coincided with his death. In any given year, Buddhists observe various special occasions. Some commemorate major events in the life of the Buddha. Others celebrate different institutional features of the tradition, others are tied to seasonal festivities. And still others are linked to special events only in certain countries.
What kind of religious calendar do Buddhists observe?
Since Buddhism has long been identified with so many different cultural settings, there is some variation in the ways Buddhists keep track of sacred times. The basic religious calendar remains tied, at least nominally, to the ancient Hindu combination of lunar and solar reckoning. But many Buddhists now observe some festivities on fixed dates. The earliest Buddhists apparently did not concern themselves with marking special occurrences on their calendar. But within a generation or so, India's growing and spreading Buddhist communities began to incorporate religious social occasions into ordinary life. As Buddhist communities arose outside of India, they naturally tended to blend religious observances imported by Buddhist missionaries with the indigenous festivities of the land. In most places where Buddhism is an important presence today, the reckoning of years begins with the date of the Buddha's entry into nirvana, which coincided with his death. In any given year, Buddhists observe various special occasions. Some commemorate major events in the life of the Buddha. Others celebrate different institutional features of the tradition, others are tied to seasonal festivities. And still others are linked to special events only in certain countries.
Are there cyclical observances or feasts that occur regularly but not just once a year?
During each lunar month, many Buddhists observe 4 special moon days called Aposatha. These are the full moon and new moon days, and days midway between them, or the 1st, 8th, 15th, and 23rd of the month. Originally important as fast days in ancient Hindu practice, Buddhists now attach special ceremonies to them, somewhat the way Christians do to Sundays, Jews to Saturdays, and Muslims to Fridays. Lay Buddhists in some countries still regularly congregate in the local temple for a time of heightened religious discipline. Rituals include listening to a monk preach, meditating, and praying as monks chant the scriptures. Some devotees seek to gain spiritual merit by observing 8, rather than the usual 5, precepts during that day. Monastic life attaches special meaning to the new and full moon days. Monks assemble then to recite the rules of monastic discipline from a text called the Pratimoksha. They also engage in a communal confession of faults, not unlike the traditional practice known as the Chapter of Faults in some Christian religious orders and monastic communities. After the monks recite each prohibition in the Pratimoksha, they pause to allow individuals to admit any transgression. Some Buddhists engage in fasting on new and full moon days, emulating the monastic practice of taking no food between noon and breakfast the following day.
Are there cyclical observances or feasts that occur regularly but not just once a year?
During each lunar month, many Buddhists observe 4 special moon days called Aposatha. These are the full moon and new moon days, and days midway between them, or the 1st, 8th, 15th, and 23rd of the month. Originally important as fast days in ancient Hindu practice, Buddhists now attach special ceremonies to them, somewhat the way Christians do to Sundays, Jews to Saturdays, and Muslims to Fridays. Lay Buddhists in some countries still regularly congregate in the local temple for a time of heightened religious discipline. Rituals include listening to a monk preach, meditating, and praying as monks chant the scriptures. Some devotees seek to gain spiritual merit by observing 8, rather than the usual 5, precepts during that day. Monastic life attaches special meaning to the new and full moon days. Monks assemble then to recite the rules of monastic discipline from a text called the Pratimoksha. They also engage in a communal confession of faults, not unlike the traditional practice known as the Chapter of Faults in some Christian religious orders and monastic communities. After the monks recite each prohibition in the Pratimoksha, they pause to allow individuals to admit any transgression. Some Buddhists engage in fasting on new and full moon days, emulating the monastic practice of taking no food between noon and breakfast the following day.
Was Buddhism ever identified with any political regimes?
Buddhism enjoyed the patronage of 2 very influential Indian monarchs. A ruler of the Maurya dynasty named Ashoka, r. 270 to 230 BCE, is credited with for the first dramatic expansion of Buddhism across much of India. He declared Buddhism the state creed and sent missionaries westward through present-day Afghanistan and south to Sri Lanka. Not until nearly 4 centuries later did Buddhism again profit from formal political support. A king of the Kushan dynasty named Kanishka, r. 120 to 162 CE, picked up where Ashoka had left off. In fact, Kanishka may have learned of Buddhism in his native land to the northwest of India as a result of Ashoka's earlier missionary endeavors. Kanishka launched a new wave of missionary activity, dispatching monks to China, Tibet, and Burma. But it was the newer Mahayana teaching that Kanishka supported. Only one other important Indian regime would give Buddhism the official seal of approval. From its capital in Bengal to the northeast, the Pala dynasty, 750-1150, supported a brand of Mahayana teaching that retained esoteric elements from Hinduism. Before the last of the Palas died, Buddhism would be nearly defunct in India. Outside of India, several Buddhist dynasties helped to establish the tradition in Southeast Asia. On Indonesia's central island, Java, the Shalandras, 778 to 864, professed a type of Mahayana teaching. Meanwhile, Buddhist monarchs helped the tradition take root in Tibet.
What is the practice known as sati?
The word sati originally referred to a woman of virtue. A reference to a newly widowed individual who joined her husband in death by throwing herself on his funeral pyre. The name comes from Shiva's wife Sati, who committed suicide after her father insulted her new husband. Ritual suicide by widows spread through medieval times and continued well into the early modern era. Even after the practice was outlawed in 1829, it continued in many villages. Incidents of sati still occasionally make headlines. But increasing social action on behalf of women's rights continues to improve the situation all over India.
How do Hindus ritualize marriage?
Traditional Hindu families continue the ancient practice of arranged marriage and generally do not countenance the kind of dating practices prevalent among non-Hindus in the United States. Marriage within one's caste remains a major concern for most Hindus, whether within India or abroad. An extended period of betrothal usually follows the initial arrangements between the families, and includes the exchange of gifts and chaperoned meetings of the betrothed. Ceremonies typically occur in the early evening, after sunset, in a venue chosen by the families. In the temple, the home, or at a local hotel. One or more priests preside over the ceremony, reciting set ritual texts from the scriptures. In India, one priest often appears as a representative for each family. Astrological consultation still often determines the specific auspicious timing of the ceremony. Wedding ceremonies begin with the family of the bride symbolically giving away their daughter. After the community greets the new couple, the officiant chants special prayers while the bride and groom sit before a fire holding hands. Concluding the formal ritual, the bride and groom express consent by taking the 7 steps symbolizing energy, vitality, success, happiness, wealth. Traditionally measured in livestock, auspicious turning of the seasons, and friendship. Extended receptions generally follow the ceremonies.
Where do Buddhists live today? Are any estimates of numbers available?
Buddhism enjoyed much greater success in other parts of Asia than in India, the land of its birth. Estimates of the global population of Buddhists varies from about 1/3 to 500 million. Political circumstances make statistics particularly hard to get for China and Tibet. But it is clear that Buddhists have suffered terribly in both areas during the past half-century. Meanwhile, the tradition has been enjoying modest revival elsewhere in Asia, and has become increasingly popular in Europe and North America as a result of both immigration and conversion. Nations with the highest percentage of Buddhists among the general population are Thailand, 94%, Cambodia, 90%, Myanmar, formerly Burma, 88%, Japan, 78%, and Korea, 45%. Many millions of Buddhists once lived in China, but their number dwindled dramatically with the advent of the communist system. Buddhism has been making a comeback in China in recent years, and there are now an estimated 13,000 temples and 200,000 monks and nuns. Tibet's population was, until recently at least, almost entirely Buddhist. Between 600,000 and 1 million Buddhists, representing all major denominations, live in the United States.
Who are Mahayana Buddhists?
By contrast, Mahayana Buddhists belong to a wide variety of sub-communities, for whom the historical Buddha called Siddhartha Gautama was one of many manifestations of enlightenment capable of saving those who ask for help. Mahayana scriptures evolved in some half-dozen languages over many centuries as the tradition moved through Asia. Mahayana teaching universalized a number of classical Buddhist concepts, broadening their popular appeal and expanding the religious options available to ordinary folk. For example, Mahayana teaching regarded the historical Buddha of this age, Siddhartha Gautama, as only one of many embodiments of enlightenment. Not merely an ethical model, the Buddha was actually a world-filling spiritual presence and power. The compassionate Bodhisattva supplanted the more self-contained Arhat as a religious ideal. Bodhisattvas represented saving grace as well as a lofty goal to which any person might aspire. Mahayana teachings expanded still further by personifying wisdom as a feminine principle. Attractive and accessible. At the same time, somewhat paradoxically, Mahayana tradition was also a great deal more open to the sort of speculative thinking most Theravadins considered fruitless. Mahayana philosophers developed the concept of emptiness, shunyata, for example, as a way of emphasizing the futility of clinging to anything at all, even to neat doctrinal distinctions. Of the dozen or so Mahayana schools and denominations that arose in India, China, and Japan, too deserve special mention here. First and most popular are the Pure Land communities. Amitabha, Amida in Japan, one of the 5 transcendent or meditational Buddhas, rules the Western paradise called the Pure Land. Devotees seek rebirth in that heavenly realm through various spiritual means, including the simple repetition of phrases such as "Glory to Amida Buddha." In addition, several major Chan, Zen in Japan, lineages have been extraordinarily influential in Eastern Asia. The Soto school emphasizes quiet, methodical meditation, while the Rinzai school uses, in addition, the mind-stopping device called the koan to hasten the seeker's experience of enlightenment.
Is there such a thing as a Buddhist saint?
Nearly all of the Mahayana denominations look to special embodiments of holiness for guidance, inspiration, and even the occasional miracle. Japanese Buddhists call some of these figures shonin, an honorific designation bestowed especially on patriarchs and founders of lineages and denominations. A group called the 18 Lohans, Lohan is derived from the Sanskrit term arhat, are set apart from the Buddha's earliest disciples as uniquely sacred because of their unselfish commitment to spreading the Dharma rather than retire into peaceful solitude. Theravada tradition still uses the term arhat, worthy one, to refer to a living embodiment of sanctity and wisdom. But the arhat remains an ethical model only, and a rather distant ideal at that. Mahayana teaching sees the bodhisattva as the ultimate in human potential. Some even confer the title on living individuals, such as the Dalai Lama. Bodhisattvas not only model spiritual perfection, but function as mediators as well, as emissaries of the various Buddhas. They exercise saving power and make comforting grace available to all who ask.
What does one do to convert to Buddhism?
Since Buddhist tradition generally does not emphasize doctrine, becoming a Buddhist ordinarily does not involve lengthy periods of education or examination on the teachings. Various Buddhist organizations do, however, produce catechism-like texts designed for beginners interested in joining the faith. There is no universally practiced ritual for welcoming converts. Perhaps the single most important ritual element in the process of becoming a Buddhist is the taking of the 3 refuges. Many who decide to become Buddhists seek the tutelage of a spiritual guide. Especially in the various Zen and Tibetan organizations. Unlike converts to some other traditions, new Buddhists seem to be less concerned with seeking salvation than with finding a personally satisfying approach to everyday life. It is perhaps ironic that a tradition that de-emphasizes doctrine attracts more people committed to studying the tradition in depth than do many traditions in which doctrine plays a more central role. Above all, Buddhists almost universally agree that nothing in any religious doctrinal system leads to salvation in itself.
What gender-related issues are important for Buddhists?
Tradition has it that the Buddha rejected various forms of social discrimination deeply embedded in the Indian culture of his day. He is said to have repudiated caste distinctions altogether. The Buddha's attitudes toward the place of women in religion and society also represented a step forward in some respects, but many problems remained. When the Buddha's aunt, who had raised him after his mother died, asked to be allowed into the Sangha, the Buddha balked. Only after a prominent monk named Ananda took up the woman's cause did the Buddha relent. So began the Buddhist order of nuns. But female members of the order have never achieved the status of their male counterparts. There has been a breakdown in the lineage of the nun Sangha, a complete rupture. According to some historians, some women continue to live in community and call themselves nuns, but they lack official sanction. A sore point for many women has been that classical Buddhist teaching says that women must be reborn as men before having a chance at nirvana. Still, it appears that early Buddhist tradition did introduce significant improvements in the lot of many women in India. No longer merely the possessions of their men, women had a larger purpose than childbearing, had personal psychic lives and could seek their own spiritual goals. So much of the gender bias that persists everywhere in our world has a great deal more to do with culture than with any one religious tradition as such. Interaction of religious tradition and culture often makes it impossible to distinguish between the two. But it is not uncommon for people in any given culture to claim religious sanction for time-honored values and practices even when the religious tradition sources offer little support for them.
Are there any Buddhist holy sites or cities?
Important to Buddhists universally are the places associated with central events in the life of the Buddha. Sites identified with his birth, the Lumbini Grove, Enlightenment, Bodh Gaya. First sermon, the Deer Park near Benares, and entering into Nirvana, Kushanagara. are at the top of the list. Pilgrims from all over the world now travel to India. On pilgrimage to these and dozens of other locations of slightly lesser importance. No one city in India functions for Buddhists quite the way Mecca, Jerusalem, and Rome do for Muslims, Jews, and many Christians. Various cities have become associated with important Buddhist temples and monasteries. But they have rarely if ever attracted pilgrims precisely as cities. Instead, pilgrims head for specific sites and temples. Outside India, dozens of places are sacred to members of the various Buddhist denominations. Many are associated with mountains. Ancient pre-Buddhist traditions in both China and Japan, for example, attributed supreme sanctity to the high places that, according to some spiritual maps, marked the outer limits of the cosmos at the cardinal points. Different sects and lineages often chose mountains for their spiritual centers because of the centrality of Mt Meru in ancient Hindu myth. Mountains symbolize a point of interconnection among the several levels of the cosmos. They also can be readily imagined as huge mandalas around which spiritual seekers circumambulate en route to the center.
Who are Vajrayana Buddhists?
Vajrayana Buddhism consists of a number of schools and lineages that blended Mahayana concepts with the esoteric interpretations of Hinduism's tantric schools. Local pre-Buddhist elements of shamanism and folk religion gave further distinctiveness to the different schools. In some places, Vajrayana, also called Tantrayana, esoteric vehicle, has blended with popular traditions. In the monasteries, the monks and mystical adepts engage in arcane rituals open only to initiates. But the monks also minister to the public through more accessible teaching and worship. Monastic institutions have dominated much of everyday life in the Himalayan nations and, until recently, to a greater degree than elsewhere in Asia. Many of the largest and most powerful monasteries are perched high above cities and villages so that their physical setting is itself an unmistakable symbol of their centrality. Before the Chinese takeover of Tibet, as many as 1 out of 5 Tibetans were monks or nuns. Some half a dozen major monastic orders developed, of which the Dalai Lama's Gelugpa order is now the best known. Vajrayana Buddhists developed their own extensive sacred scriptures, largely by way of translation of Indian Sanskrit and Chinese texts. In 108 volumes, the Kanjur, translation of the word, includes monastic regulations along with philosophy. The 225-volume Tanjur, translation of treatises, includes sutras, tantras, and commentaries on them. Perhaps most distinctive of the various Vajrayana schools is the use of special ritual symbolism and meditative techniques to achieve their spiritual objectives. Visualization techniques and highly developed forms of chanting assist the meditator toward union with the divine center. outside Tibet and the other Himalayan nations. Vajrayana tradition exercised considerable influence on the increasingly esoteric Japanese Shingon school.
How do Hindus deal ritually with death and mourning?
Hindus generally prefer cremation to burial, and most hope that their loved ones will scatter their ashes over the waters of the Ganges or one of India's many other sacred rivers. Every year many thousands of Hindu families bring the bodies of their loved ones to Benares for cremation at the burning ghats, steps, toward the downstream side of the holy city. There, or closer to home if they cannot travel easily. Led by the eldest son or an older male relative, the family completes a set of ancient rituals. They bathe and dress the body and light the pyre. The ritual leader walks 4 times to the left around the pyre and pours ghee over the body while the family chant divine names. For anywhere from 8 days to a month the family observes a period of mourning and ritual impurity. To bring that period to a close, many families arrange a ritual meal called shraddha. Relatives must minister to and nourish the dead person's spirit, lest it continue to travel abroad as a restless and potentially troublesome demon. In the case of a famous Brahmin, an extended period of mourning might last a full year. Especially holy persons, such as noted gurus, are sometimes not cremated but buried, seated upright in the lotus posture. Some sects, such as the Lingayats or Virashaivas, prefer burial for all members, possibly the result of Islamic influence. Hindus in Europe and the United States generally cremate their dead within 24 hours of death. Mourners, wearing mostly white, gather at the home for a final viewing. Family members often arrange a memorial service in the local temple to observe the death anniversary.
What are some of the main features of Buddhism's relationships to other traditions?
Buddhism's most important connections historically have been with Hinduism, out of which it grew, and the major indigenous traditions of the Asian lands to which it spread. Over the centuries, Buddhists have therefore interacted primarily with Hindus, Deists, Confucians, and adherents of Shinto. An earlier question outlined crucial features Buddhism's relationship to Hinduism. Here are some features of Buddhism's conceptual connections with the other traditions. China's ancient deist tradition made room for the Buddha among the swelling ranks of its deities, even claiming that foundational figure Lao Tzu had himself become a Buddha. Dharma, some scholars argued, was the Buddhist analogy to the concept of the way or Deo. They suggested further parallels between the Buddhist Arhat and the deist immortal, and between nirvana and the concept of non-action. Confucian tradition also found ways of accommodating to the newcomer. Some scholars saw in Buddhist ethics a parallel to Confucian filial piety. Even though Buddhist elevation of celibate monasticism seemed quite irreconcilable with the Confucian emphasis on family life. To Buddhism's 5 precepts some likened Confucianism's 5 constant virtues. When Buddhist missionaries brought the new teaching to Japan, the Buddha met the kami, high beings, of the indigenous tradition called Shinto. As was so often the case in China and elsewhere, Buddhism's ability to survive and grow in its new environment depended a great deal on royal patronage. Imperial support gave impetus to various Buddhist Shinto accommodations. Shinto's sun goddess, Amaterasu, became a counterpart to the Buddha of infinite light, Vairochana. Hachiman, Shinto deity of war, dressed as a Buddhist monk and became the guardian of the great Buddha. And in Mahayana teachings multiple Buddhas and Bodhisattvas some saw parallels to Shinto's countless kami. Representatives of various Buddhist denominations have continued active dialogue with other traditions, especially through the monastic connection.
What are the main sub-communities or denominations within Buddhism?
There are 3 major subdivisions of the Buddhist tradition. Theravada, wisdom of the elders, Buddhism predominates in Sri Lanka and throughout most of Southeast Asia, with the exception of Vietnam. Of the over half dozen, some say as many as 18, so-called Hinayana, small vehicle schools that developed in India by the 2nd century BCE, the Theravada alone has survived in numbers into modern times. Mahayana, great vehicle, Buddhism in a large number of sub-denominations. And schools took hold particularly in northeastern Asia, China, Korea, and Japan. Vajrayana, thunderbolt vehicle, Buddhism consists of several schools of esoteric thought and practice. They took hold particularly in the Himalayan region, in countries such as Tibet, Nepal, Sikkim, and Bhutan.
Who was the monk Isai?
The Japanese Buddhist monk Isai, 1141–1215, introduced the Zen Buddhist Rinzai sect to Japan. And under him Zen first became acknowledged as an independent school of Buddhism. He is also responsible for popularizing the cultivation of tea in Japan. Also known by his honorific title of Zenko Kokushi, national teacher. Isai came from a family of Shinto priests in the district of Okayama. Like many famous priests in his period, he studied at the Great 10-Day Center on Mt. Hai. In 1168 he made his first trip to China, where he visited Zen centers, especially those flourishing on Mt. Tiantai. He was much impressed by what he saw and felt with growing conviction that Zen could contribute greatly to a reawakening of Buddhist faith in Japan. In 1187 he undertook a second trip to the continent for the purpose of tracing the origins of Buddhism to India. The authorities, however, refused him permission to go beyond Chinese borders. He studied on Mt Tien Tai until 1191, where he was ordained in the Rinzai, Chinese, Linqi, sect and returned to Japan. He constructed the first Rinzai temple, the Shofukuji, at Hakata in Kyushu. Issai proclaimed the superiority of Zen mediation over other Buddhist disciplines, thus provoking the ire of the Tendai monks who sought to outlaw the new sect. However, Issai enjoyed the protection of the shogun Minamoto Yorya, and in 1202 he was given the direction of the Kenninji in Kyoto. Like Seiko, and particularly Nichiren, Issai associated his type of Buddhism with national welfare and promoted Zen by publishing a tract entitled Kozen Goko Kuran, the propagation of Zen for the protection of the country.
So what happens in Buddhist mysticism?
Some sources talk of realizing the emptiness of all things. Profound experience of the meaning of the Four Noble Truths transcends all ordinary levels of awareness. It is possible to attain nirvana in this life. Nirvana with a remainder. They call it, and that means full insight into the way things are. One who arrives at such a state of objectless contemplation might justifiably be called a Buddhist mystic.
Have there been any important Buddhist religious reformers?
Many of the various Buddhist denominations and sects are the result of attempts at reform. Some people even regard the Buddha himself as one who sought to reform Hinduism. Among the best examples of religious reformers are those who aimed to rescue Buddhist teaching from complex formulas and make it accessible to real people. Tradition calls Bodhidharma d. 532, the first patriarch of Chinese Zen. Apparently quite a colorful character. Bodhidharma criticized several schools for getting lost in their own long-winded treatises. Toss all the superfluous verbiage, he advised, and focus on direct Dharma transmission from master to student. About 3 centuries later in Japan, 2 other reformers set out to develop spiritual methods that would appeal to a broader public than some of the schools that had arrived in Japan during the previous several centuries. Kyokai, 744 to 835, and Seiko, 762 to 822, founded the Tendai and Shinjin lineages, respectively. But eventually Tendai turned more speculative and Shinjin more mystical and esoteric. Further reform developments eventually grew out of Tendai in the 12th and 13th centuries. A Tendai monk, Honen, 1133 to 1212. Started a Japanese branch of Pure Land in hope of attracting people with its reliance on Amida Buddha. A successor named Nichiren, 1222 to 82, took Honen's insights a step further, insisting that a devotee approaching in good faith had only to repeat the name of the scripture called the lotus. Of the Good Law Sutra, a mantra popular singer Tina Turner recommends to be assured of salvation.
How did Gautama become the Buddha?
At the age of 29, tradition says, Gautama made the great renunciation of comfort and security. Borne aloft by his horse, he went over the palace walls to pursue a realistic understanding of the world and the human condition. Gautama went first to learn from two Hindu teachers, spiritual guides like those who tutor seekers in the Hindu scriptures called the Upanishads. Unsatisfied with that more philosophical approach, Gautama joined a group of ascetics in Benares. Representatives of the Jain movement perhaps, and subjected himself to several years of dire austerity. When that, too, failed, he moved on and decided to meditate alone under a tree until he achieved enlightenment. During the course of 7 weeks there, Siddhartha went through 4 trance-like stages, arriving finally at the stark realization of what Buddhist tradition calls the most basic truths of human life. Siddhartha was now worthy of the name Buddha, the enlightened one. But tradition suggests that the Buddha experienced a terrible interior struggle with the temptation to keep his newfound wisdom to himself. Mara, the demon, summoned up all his might to prevent the truths of enlightenment from spreading abroad. Overcoming all inclination to selfishness, the 35-year-old Buddha dedicated himself to teaching others the way to freedom from attachment that is the cause of all suffering. He returned to Benares, reunited with the 5 ascetics with whom he had parted company earlier, and preached the sermon called Turning the Wheel of the Law. Now the Buddha was indeed a wheel turner, but not as his father had envisioned. For the next 45 years, he would turn the greatest of all wheels, that of the Dharma. He died in Kushinagara at the age of 80, in about 463 BCE, of apparent food poisoning. Buddha on the big screen, some favorite motion pictures. Green Snake, 1993. A combination of mysticism and action based on a Chinese fable. Green Snake, Maggie Cheung, and Sun Qing, Joey Wong, are actual reptiles who have been practicing taking human form. When self-righteous Buddhist monk Fa Hai discovers them, he thinks it's a sin to tamper with the natural order. Cantonese with English subtitles. Kundan. 1997, in 1937, in a remote area of Tibet close to the Chinese border, a 2-year-old child is identified as the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama, the compassionate Buddha. He is brought to Lhasa to be schooled as a monk and as head of state. The film follows him into adulthood until his flight to India after the Chinese invasion of Tibet. Little Buddha. 1993, Tibetan Lama Norbu informs the Conrad family of Seattle that their 10-year-old son Jesse may be the reincarnation of a respected monk. Stars Keanu Reeves? 7 years in Tibet. 1997, Heinrich Harrer, Brad Pitt, travels to the Himalayas on a mountain climbing trip. War breaks out and he is placed in a prisoner of war camp. He escapes to Tibet where he befriends the young Dalai Lama and witnesses the escalation of the conflict between Tibet and China. Temptation of a monk. 1994, costume drama about China's 7th century Tang dynasty. General Shi, Wu Xianguo, is duped into an assassination plot against the crown prince. After a massacre, the general flees and finds sanctuary with a group of Buddhist monks at a remote temple. Why has Bodhidharma left for the East? 1989. Set in a remote monastery in the Korean mountains, the film follows an old master, close to death, who must lead his disciples in their search for spiritual freedom. Korean with English subtitles.
What kind of religious calendar do Buddhists observe?
Since Buddhism has long been identified with so many different cultural settings, there is some variation in the ways Buddhists keep track of sacred times. The basic religious calendar remains tied, at least nominally, to the ancient Hindu combination of lunar and solar reckoning. But many Buddhists now observe some festivities on fixed dates. The earliest Buddhists apparently did not concern themselves with marking special occurrences on their calendar. But within a generation or so, India's growing and spreading Buddhist communities began to incorporate religious social occasions into ordinary life. As Buddhist communities arose outside of India, they naturally tended to blend religious observances imported by Buddhist missionaries with the indigenous festivities of the land. In most places where Buddhism is an important presence today, the reckoning of years begins with the date of the Buddha's entry into nirvana, which coincided with his death. In any given year, Buddhists observe various special occasions. Some commemorate major events in the life of the Buddha. Others celebrate different institutional features of the tradition, others are tied to seasonal festivities. And still others are linked to special events only in certain countries.
Have there been important Buddhist mystics?
If transforming encounter with mystery and the cultivation of mental and spiritual states beyond everyday awareness counts as mysticism, then Buddhist tradition can certainly claim its mystics. But there are important differences between Buddhist mysticism and those of traditions such as Hinduism, Islam, and Christianity. All three of those traditions talk of at least two large categories of extraordinary spiritual experience: in theistic or dualistic mystical experience, the human person meets the divine other but retains his or her individuality. In monistic or cosmic mysticism, the human person becomes one with, or realizes the oneness that already exists in, an ultimate reality, with no trace of individuality surviving. Buddhist teaching insists that there is no self to begin with, so neither of those two models quite fits. True, some Buddhist schools use the language and symbolism of deity and union. But they understand those symbols as meditative aids rather than representations of metaphysical realities.
Have Buddhists traditionally sent out missionaries to convert others?
Buddhism's vigorous missionary heritage is traditionally traced to Kings Ashoka. 270 to 230 BCE, and Kanishka, r. c. 120 to 160 CE. The first is said to have converted to Buddhism after repenting of his bloody conquests. Ashoka declared the Buddha's teaching the official creed of the realm. Tradition credits Kanishka with supplying a major impetus to Buddhism's spread into Central and Eastern Asia. Monks, and, to a lesser extent, nuns, have historically been the most important and effective missionaries. Wherever they traveled, they carried sacred texts and art as their prime teaching tools. Buddhist missionary work continues in the form of various contemporary adaptations of traditional methods of evangelization. They call their missionary workers Dhammadutas, those who spread the Dharma. Convinced of the universal relevance of the teaching. In much of Theravada Southeast Asia, missionaries continue to bring the message of Buddhism to rural areas. In Thailand, for example, teams of 5 travel about from March to June. Then return to monasteries for the rainy season retreat. They begin by setting up a monastery and training young boys in the temple compound. Eventually they start to visit homes and ask about people's general well-being. The next step is to start elementary schools and encourage youngsters to enter the monastic life. Reducing crime and maintaining order according to the Buddha believed that there is a direct correlation between crime and poverty. Because crime and immorality lead to poverty, it would be useless to suppress crime through punishment. The Buddha preached that if society were to improve the economic conditions of the poor, then crime would cease. Order could be maintained through mutual love, affection, and respect between citizens. The Buddha not only preached these utopian ideals but also experimented with them. For example, governing the society of Buddhist monks and nuns is a strict code of vows enforcing the Buddha's vision. Every gift received is to be collectively held in the name of the group, not the individual.
Who was the Buddha and what does tradition say about his early life?
According to widely accepted tradition, a child called Siddhartha. He who has achieved his goal, Gautama, was born around 563 BCE. Recent scholarship has begun to offer various views as to the chronology of the Buddha's life. But this text will retain the more traditional account since it conveys an important sense of the feel of Buddhist lore. Siddhartha's father, Shuddhodana, was a wealthy member of the ruling elite, a prince of sorts. When the child was born, his father consulted religious specialists to see what portents the boy's body might communicate. They told him the child was destined to become either a world renouncer or a wheel turner, Chakravartin. An expression roughly equivalent to mover and shaker and sometimes extended to mean king of all India. Shuddodana resolved that his son would take the path of power and influence. So he contrived to shelter the boy from any experience that might incline him another way. Gautama lived a life of ease and pleasure in his father's palace. Surrounded by wealth and beauty and the trappings of authority, he married at 16 and had a son. As it turned out, Gautama's father failed to insulate his son from contact with the harsher side of life. Eventually Gautama would leave the palace, as well as his own wife and child, and seek his own path. The traditional story is clearly meant to underscore certain dramatic elements in the Buddha's spiritual development. His son, Rahula, reappears later in the story as one of the early monks. And his wife is said to have become one of the first nuns.
What were the 4 passing sites?
On several occasions the young Gautama had to leave the confines of the palace. Although his father instructed his servants to clear the road of any unsightly reminders of human frailty, Gautama would nevertheless find himself asking the hardest questions of all. On one excursion, he saw someone bent and struggling to walk. Old age, his servants explained, a hardship many people must eventually face. Another time, Gautama spotted a leper lying by the way in pain. That was illness, his servants explained, it happened to many people. Then one day Gautama's entourage came across a funeral procession. Death, said his servants, and no one escapes that. Finally, according to the traditional account, Gautama saw by the road a young man who obviously possessed nothing and yet seemed content. That was the world renouncer Shuddodana so badly wanted his son not to become. The traditional account holds that all of the 4 experiences resulted from divine intervention. The gods assuming the roles of suffering human beings so that Gautama would be moved to take the next critical steps in ensuring the possibility of enlightenment for humankind. The clearly formulaic account admirably sums up the key issues that would eventually provide the foundations of Gautama's enlightenment and Buddhahood.
What were the earliest Buddhist sacred texts?
For several centuries the Buddhist community preserved the treasure of the Buddha's teachings orally. Monks and devout laypersons memorized increasingly formulaic versions of what the Buddha had said and the way he had behaved. As the community of monks became more stable, settling for longer periods in fixed residences, the practice of communal recitation of the sacred Words became the primary mechanism for maintaining the teachings intact. Any error in recitation could be corrected immediately to ensure uniformity and, it was believed, perfect accuracy. Local communities recited the text in their own vernaculars, since no one sacred language had been decreed. Earliest texts were organized into three major groupings or baskets, Pitaka. 1. Called the Vinaya Pitaka, contained all the rules of monastic discipline. Another gathered the Buddha's speeches, the Sutra Pitaka, and a third, much later. Text included 7 lengthy theoretical interpretations of the Buddha's teaching, the Abhidharma Pitaka. At a gathering called the Third Council in 250 BCE, members agreed on the first official formulation of all three baskets as a single scripture called the Tripitaka in a northeastern Indian language called Pali. Monks continued to keep the texts alive almost exclusively through memory for perhaps another century or so. Finally, the sacred texts were systematically committed to writing and became the basis of what is now known as the Pali Canon.
When and where did Buddhism begin?
Buddhism began in a region of northeast India, part of which is present-day Nepal. During the mid-6th century BCE, the kingdom of Koshala ruled the area from its capital city of Shravasti, also known as Kapilavastu. One of the realm's leading factions was the Shakya clan. Traditionally identified as belonging to the Kshatriya or warrior caste. India at that time was politically fragmented into well over a dozen major regional powers. The vast majority of the population practiced forms of Hindu tradition under the leadership of a strong Brahmin priesthood. Ritual and belief centered largely on this worldly concerns, such as managing weather to ensure good harvest and curing illness. But some who had inherited the ancient tradition were beginning to question its efficacy. The famed holy city of Benares was part of the Koshala realm. There and elsewhere in the kingdom, individuals and small groups of religious seekers raised issues about possible life after death, including the notion of rebirth into other modes of existence. Within the Hindu tradition, the new questioning gave rise to the scriptures called the Upanishads. With their deep reflection on the nature of the self and of greater spiritual realities. Some of these new seekers parted company with mainstream Hindu tradition altogether, and eventually developed into whole new communities of belief and practice. One such community is now called the Jain tradition, named after the Jainas or spiritual conquerors to whom tradition attributes its founding spirit. The demanding ascetic discipline taught by Jainism's Tirthankaras, those who find crossing places in the river, formed one of the religious options available as early Buddhism developed. Buddhism itself would join Jainism as one of a number of splinter groups that, from a Hindu perspective, were unacceptable. These heretics got the name Nastika. Those who deny the fundamentals of Hindu belief as it was evolving then. What we now call Buddhism thus grew out of an age of political and spiritual ferment, offering seekers one of a number of significant religious options.
Do Buddhists believe in angels?
Buddhist popular belief inherited and retained many of the different types of celestial and semi-divine beings that populated Hindu myth. Nearly all Hindu deities have their personal attendants. In addition, a variety of other spiritual presences fill the heavenly and earthly realms. Artists often depict these characters as floating gracefully, but they generally lack the wings most people associate with angels. A class of being called apsaras, Sanskrit for moving in water, are the most numerous of these denizens of the intermediate realm. Early Buddhist artists sometimes depicted apsaras as devotees worshipping the Buddha's footprints or gathered around the tree of enlightenment. Another group, called the Gandharvas, were Hindu demigods who entertained the deities as musicians and dancers. Buddhist tradition retained them in that capacity. The classic angelic function of guardianship and protection resides in other classes of beings regarded as gods in some sects. Lokapalas, world guardians, are those who stand watch over the four quarters of the universe. Many Buddhist temples depict them as muscular, heavily armed gatekeepers. The Dharmapalas, guardians of the teaching, are a band of fearsome deities whose task is to guard believers, especially in Vajrayana. As a kind of personal deity assigned to each individual, these protectors can take on either benevolent or angry form, depending on whether they are dealing with a believer or with an enemy of the faith.
Who are Theravada Buddhists?
Theravada Buddhists are members of a more or less homogeneous community of faith and worship built around the notion that the Buddha was a human being who taught by example. The historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, was the last of many non-human and human reincarnations of the Buddha to be a separate school from the Second Council on in the 4th century BCE. Their main scriptures are called collectively the Pali Canon. Theravadins seek deliverance from rebirth by eliminating craving and ignorance through self-discipline. The ideal and model of the enlightened life is the Arhat. Arhats benefit others chiefly by their example, and they possess no saving power as such. They embody primarily the virtue of wisdom. Their ultimate goal, nirvana, is a state beyond this world of samsara in which the liberated person experiences neither desire nor impressions of any kind. Theravada sources describe nirvana as a permanent pleasant state of knowledge, freedom, and peace that is largely the result of a process of personal effort. When Theravadins pray, their primary intent is more to honor the Buddha than to worship him. All good acts, including religious ritual. Done with proper intent can help one gain merit toward the eradication of negative karma. For most Theravada Buddhists, the concepts of merit making and merit transfer are more basic and accessible than the kind of lofty ethical and spiritual discipline embodied in an arhat. There are, of course, some regional and cultural variations in Theravada expression and practice, but considerably less so than in the other main branches of Buddhist tradition.
What other early schools and scriptures are especially important in the history of Buddhism?
A number of early Buddhist schools or denominations arose in India during the 5 or 6 centuries after the Buddha's death. One cluster, known collectively as the Hinayana, small vehicle, schools, developed as a result of differing interpretations of what manner of being the Buddha was. The most important of these schools is the Theravada. Wisdom of the Elders, the branch largely responsible for the Pali Canon. Theravada Buddhists taught that the Buddha was a historical human being who counseled others to pursue their own path to enlightenment. But some Buddhists incline toward more expansive, spiritual interpretation. The Mahasanghikas, proponents of the Great Assembly, taught that the Buddha's many previous lives as a Buddha to be a bodhisattva. Prior to his birth as Siddhartha Gautama meant that the Buddha was more of a cosmic spiritual being than a mere mortal. All but one volume of their sizable Sanskrit, called Buddhist hybrid, scriptures have been lost. Another school, the Sarvastivadins, proponents of the view that all exists, further emphasized the importance of the bodhisattva's spiritual evolution as a model of growth in virtue. They, too, produced a body of sacred writing. But the Sanskrit originals were lost and we know of them through Chinese and Tibetan translations. Next to the Theravada school, the most important of the early denominations was the Mahayana, Great Vehicle, so called because of its wider appeal. Mahayana teaching emphasized the larger-than-life qualities of the Buddha. More than a mere mortal, the Buddha was a saving figure whose compassion filled the universe and whose grace was available to all who asked. Mahayana scriptures in Sanskrit included sutras claiming to be the Buddha's own words, commentaries and treatises called shastras, and esoteric works called tantras used by smaller sects.
Are dreams and visions important to Buddhist tradition?
Important figures in Buddhist tradition are said to have learned essential truths through dreams and visions. Queen Maya dreamed that she would give birth under unusual circumstances to a child who would become the Buddha. In dreams, famous people learn of the proper course of action. Buddhist sources tell, for example, of how a dream persuaded the Chinese Emperor Mingdi to send for Buddhist missionaries and scriptures. Stories of this sort are told about many holy persons throughout Buddhist history, usually as a vehicle for underscoring the individual's personal authority. Accounts of dreams and visions are by no means uniquely Buddhist, of course, and tell us more about the tone and feel of popular Buddhist lore than about the tradition's central teachings. Visionary meditative techniques, a different matter altogether, are of great importance in some Mahayana schools. Esoteric schools, such as those of Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism, use mandalas as visual aids in complicated techniques for creating mental images. The meditator generates a visionary world patterned on the mandala, in which the divine and the human interact and all distinctions vanish. Simpler visualization techniques are used in the more popular Pure Land tradition as well. Facing west, the meditator visualizes the sun setting, and water turning into ice. Gradually, the mind fills with images of a golden land with crystalline streams, lotus-filled lakes with golden bottoms, and shores of diamond sand. As the Pure Land, with its myriad jeweled palaces, takes shape in the mind's eye, the meditator sees the Buddha Amitabha and his attendant bodhisattvas. At length the meditator visualizes himself being reborn into that happy land enfolded in a lotus flower.